Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Megan Ryerson. I'm the chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning. I'm joined by Jeannie Birch, the director of the Penn Institute for Urban Research. And we're delighted to co-sponsor this event where Professor Erick Guerra of the Department of City and Regional Planning here at the Weitzman School of Design, fellow of Penn IUR, and also Associate Dean for Research at the Weitzman School, is going to speak about his book, Overbuilt, the High Costs and Low Rewards of U.S. Highway Construction. I don't need to tell you, Erick is one of the nation's leading voices, leading experts in transportation and land use planning. His research examines how the built environment and transportation investments shape access, equity, environmental outcomes, both in the developing world and focusing here in the U.S., particularly on highway policies. In Overbuilt, Erick draws on historical narratives, his own narratives, and extensive empirical evidence to demonstrate how excess roadway capacity continues to shape urban form, economies, equity outcomes, accessibility, and so on. I think what's so exciting to be in this room with planners and practitioners and policymakers is that Erick's book really invites us to rethink not just building highways, but to move to a completely new paradigm centered on accessibility, equitable land use, smarter infrastructure choices, and so on. Erick is also a very close colleague of mine for 13 years, we just did the math, and in truth, Erick and I have been together for much of our academic lives, being undergrads together and graduate students together. I have had the distinct pleasure of learning from him, discussing all different kinds of transportation topics with him, having him peer review my work when we first got here together and when I joined planning. I've learned a tremendous amount from him, and that's just going to continue in the next hour and a half and beyond. So thank you so much, Erick. We're so looking forward to this. Thank you, everyone. Let's welcome Erick.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Jeannie. Thank you, everyone from the department, especially Kate Daniel for helping set this up, and Amy and Megan from Penn IUR for supporting. First and foremost, I want to thank my current and former students in the room. I would not have written this book if it weren't for teaching Intro to Transportation Planning for the last 13 years. And I really learned a lot through that process. And in many ways, this book is the culmination of those years of teaching and interacting with my students. I want to start this talk with a story. On December 18th, 1991, President George H.W. Bush signed the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act, or ICE-T, at a highway construction site on Texas State Highway 360. The $155 billion bipartisan bill, that's $370 billion today, heralded the biggest shift in federal transportation priorities since President Dwight Eisenhower's 1956 National Interstate and Defense Highways Act, the law that helped fund and build the interstate highway system. The transportation law opened with lofty statements about economic efficiency, environmental soundness, energy efficiency, fiscal responsibility, multimodality, and the mobility needs of the poor, elderly, and physically disabled. ICE-T funded the last few segments of the originally planned interstate system, which is generally considered to have been completed around the same year. This shift in national transportation priorities was clear when Bush announced, we've got to take full advantage of our present opportunity to create a surface transportation program that will meet our present and future needs, not our past problems. In many ways, ICE-T represented a move away from past problems and the culmination of decades of reforms to make highway builders treat people and the environment with greater respect, The early years of highway building had displaced hundreds of thousands of residents, particularly in Black and immigrant communities, cut citizens from waterfronts, demolished historic downtowns, reinforced social segregation, and contributed to rapidly deteriorating air and water quality. All this with almost no local oversight or ability to make alternative investments. Policymakers on both sides of the aisle hailed the law as a resounding success. Bush praised the law as the most important transportation bill since President Eisenhower started the interstate system 35 years ago. Republican Secretary of Transportation Sam Skinner called it a landmark piece of legislation that will carry the nation into the post-interstate era. The New York Times claimed that the law dramatically, and for the most part sensibly, refocuses national transportation policy. And President Bill Clinton's Associate Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Robert F. Martinez, called it the most revolutionary approach to thinking about transportation systems since the creation of the interstate highway system. It offers a holistic approach to transportation problems that breaks with all precedent. And Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, New York Democrat and chairman of the Water Resources, Transportation, and Infrastructure Subcommittee, who had championed the bill through the House and Senate, called it a once-in-a-generation opportunity to redefine federal transportation policy. Moynihan had also been an early and vocal critic of the original Interstate Highway Program, calling it extravagant, wasteful, regionally unfair, destructive, and poorly planned in a 1960 article titled New Roads and Urban Chaos in Reporter magazine. Ice-T also served as a model for future transportation laws. The next two highway acts, T21 and Safety Lou, directly reference Ice-T through their titles and contain similar language about safety, efficiency, sustainability, and the environment. However, Ice-T largely represented a continuation of past policies. Despite the emphasis on a conservative system and a much heralded completion of the interstate system, the main emphasis of Ice-T, T21, and future transportation acts has been to spend money raised from the gas tax to build, widen, rebuild, and maintain roadways. As the system has aged and expanded, more and more gets spent on reconstruction and maintenance, but new construction has continued apace, and each additional lane mile of highway and arterial commits federal and state planners and engineers to spend even more on future maintenance and reconstruction. According to interstate historians Mark Rose and Raymond Moll, Ice-T produced few startling results. This is likely because, as historian Thomas Carnes put it, Ice-T did not change the methods of financing much, but focused more on the contribution of states and counties to design and location. And as Brian Taylor, Eric Morris, and Jeffrey Brown argue in their 2023 book on urban freeways, finance, more than anything, plays the key role in what gets built and why. Since Ice-T, the country has continued to spend billions every year adding thousands of lane miles of urban interstate, expressway, and other highway. The blue bar shows the inflation-adjusted $30 to $50 billion spent per year from the Federal Highway Trust Fund from 1990 to 2022 on rebuilding, building, and maintaining roadways. The orange line shows the increase in urban interstates and other highways over the same period. Some quick facts. The federal government spends 15 to 20 billion inflation-adjusted dollars more on highways now than it did during peak interstate construction. The US has added nearly 75% more urban interstate highways since completing the originally planned interstate. The US has added urban roadway at a rate that is 65% faster than the growth in the population. And in places like Mississippi and Arkansas, the amount of urban highways has grown 4 to 10 times faster than the population. Unfortunately, spending money to continuing to repave and rebuild an ever-widening urban highway network has been bad public policy. Overbuilt makes three central arguments. One, the US has too many and too high-capacity highways and arterials. Two, we continue to build and widen highways despite stated public policies that have focused on safety, economic competitiveness, equity, and the environment since 1990. And 3, the finance and evaluation metrics developed to build the interstate highway system continue to encourage overbuilding. And by extension, we need to change our methods of evaluation and finance to stop overbuilding. Over the next 30 minutes or so, I'd like to discuss what it means to be overbuilt, provide some evidence of overbuilding, try to explain why we keep overbuilding, and make 3 brief recommendations for how to stop overbuilding. From there, I want to take some time to discuss overbuilding in urban Mexico. I do a lot of work in Latin America and outside of the United States, and for me, one of the things that I've enjoyed most since completing this book is trying to think about where else the findings may apply and how. So what does it mean to be overbuilt? Transportation is necessary for a functioning modern society and economy. Without streets and highways, there's a severely constrained access to employment, food, and other necessities. Businesses have a difficult time attracting employees and receiving or shipping goods. However, too much roadway is also problematic. The inverse of a dysfunctional place without streets or highways is a somewhat absurd place comprised entirely of streets and highways. Roadways connect places, but they also replace other land uses like houses, businesses, parks, and schools. Roadways are the negative space that define and shape the form of cities and towns. As a thought experiment, consider a city comprised only of roadways and a city with no roads at all. Neither one would have very much value. In the former, there's nowhere to go, and in the latter, there's no way to get there. There's a balance between the form of the spaces taken by houses, offices, parks, and shops, and the in-between spaces that bind and connect them. And the balance between urban form and roadway looks substantially different around a large urban interchange and a gridded urban core. And while different layouts cannot produce development out of thin air, they do tend to produce substantially different built forms, like the ones here shown around an interchange and in downtown Philadelphia. And although the balance will inherently vary by city and within cities over time, somewhere between a place with no roads and a place comprised only of roads lies an ideal, an optimum. The costs and benefits of new roadway investments will almost certainly vary depending on how far away a city, town, or nation happens to be from that ideal. So how do we define the optimum? As a thought experiment, imagine a city that is comprised entirely of narrow, unpaved roads, giving limited and slow access to each building. The effects of the first major road investment, say a paved boulevard, would be apparent. Shops and multifamily homes would soon line the street, which now has better access to the rest of the city than anywhere else. Perhaps the benefits of a second roadway investment would be even higher. The accessibility benefits of the second major roadway might have network effects that grant even greater access and increase values along both roadways substantially. Eventually, however, the benefits of new roadways would decrease. Instead of generating new value, investments might simply shuffle land value from one place to another. The costs would also tend to increase. New roadways may require more urban land with already high accessibility and thus already high land costs. The easiest, cheapest, and best places to build have already been built out. At a certain point, the cost of building more roadways outweighs the benefits. Taking the thought experiment one step forward, traffic safety, congestion, pollution, and aesthetics, not just accessibility and costs, will play a role in defining this optimum. At a certain point, the next roadways investment's accessibility benefits fail to outweigh any of these direct or indirect costs. The previous roadway investment, however, was net beneficial. That's the theoretical optimal amount of roadway. And continuing to build beyond this optimum likely creates more harm than good, with each new road widening or expansion moving the system further and further from the optimum. In this book, I explore 3 main aspects of an overbuilt roadway system. The first focuses on economics and summarizes and expands on research that I conducted with colleague Gilles Duranton. Thank you so much for being here, Gilles. And Xinyu Ma from the Wharton School. We calculated the expected benefits of adding 10% more urban highways to the US transportation system. For context, the US has added 13 to 29% every decade since 1990. So it's not an unexpected increase. In total, I expect a 10% increase in the highway network to save urban households around 850 million hours per year at an estimated value of $145 per urban household in 2024. I'm going to normalize by urban household because the numbers are really large and hard to digest. Reducing the marginal costs of the 150 billion miles of trucking on urban highways would be worth another $33 per urban household. And these benefits are around 85% of a conservative estimate of the annualized cost of building and maintaining the 10% increase in highways, suggesting only a modest amount of overbuilding. Factoring in the value of the urban land used to build highways, however, and the benefits look to be only around 40% of the costs. This is the value that that same land would be worth if it was used for other things like shops and houses instead of highways. Factoring in a conservative estimate of the external costs of pollution, collisions, and other factors associated with the expected 7% increase in driving from a 10% increase in urban highways, and the cost of the highway expansion is around 4 times the expected benefit to motorists. While these estimates seem a bit grim, they're not far out of line with previous estimates. For example, Nobel Prize-winning economist William Vickrey estimated that the costs of the roadway system were 3 times higher than the revenues raised to build roads in 1963. By 1973, MIT economist William Wheaton estimated that the costs of new highways were already higher than the benefits. And more recently, Gilles Duranton and Matt Turner, sorry, Gilles, estimate, you guys publish so much together. Estimated that just the construction costs of new urban and interstate highways was twice as high as the benefits to motorists. So what about traffic safety? Improving traffic safety has consistently been a top priority of US surface transportation policy since 1956, and US highway officials have made great claims about the safety benefits of urban highway construction. I'll give you a moment to read the quote. Unfortunately, the US has a particularly poor traffic safety record relative to other wealthy democracies, and that record has improved more slowly over time. This plot shows the number of traffic fatalities per 100,000 residents in the US and 24 other countries that provided data to the OECD. With a fatality rate of nearly 13 per 100,000, Americans die at nearly 3 times the rate of residents of peer countries in traffic collisions. The next most dangerous country, New Zealand, has about half the traffic fatalities per capita. And within the US, the places with the most highways have the most driving, the highest average speeds, and the most traffic fatalities, both per capita and also per vehicle mile driven. This graph plots the traffic fatalities per capita against the traffic fatalities per vehicle miles of travel in the 48 continental United States and Washington, D.C. And a dangerous state like South Carolina has 4 to 5 times more fatalities, both per capita and per mile driven, than a safe one like Massachusetts. Put simply, Americans are less safe because they drive more and because they drive more under less safe conditions. And these less safe conditions are substantially more prevalent in the places that have grown much more around highway systems. One problem is that highway officials have long equated increases in speed and capacity with improvements in traffic safety. I don't have time to talk about this much during my talk, but if you're interested, it's a subject that I cover in much greater detail in Chapter 7, or you can read this fabulous book by Wes Marshall, Killed by a Traffic Engineer, that covers 100 years of practice of traffic safety in the United States. In addition to economics and traffic safety, there are a number of other high social costs associated with overbuilding. One of the most prevalent is that the US has become so car dependent that outside of a handful of old, dense cities, having access to a car is a prerequisite for participating in basic economic, social, recreational, and other activities. This figure plots the number of jobs accessible within 30 minutes by car on the x-axis and by transit on the y-axis across neighborhoods in metropolitan Boston, Massachusetts, and metropolitan Riverside, California. Two metropolitan areas with similar population sizes and very different levels of transit accessibility. In metropolitan Boston, the left image, residents in centralized neighborhoods can reach substantially more jobs by transit, as well as by foot, bike, and other modes. Most of the country, however, looks a lot more like Riverside. Some neighborhoods are more central and thus have more access to more jobs and other activities, and some neighborhoods are further away and have lower accessibility. But across the metropolitan area, access by transit is uniformly bad. Meanwhile, the costs of cars and carlessness have both risen. According to Experian, Americans owe $1.5 trillion on over 63 million car loans, with an average loan of $24,000. Transportation is the second highest household expenditure item after housing. Fully 42% of US households report that owning and operating a car is a financial burden. And although the US poverty rate fell nearly in half between 1960 and 2014, it increased slightly for households without cars. Gaining access to a car is associated with finding better paying work within a year, and programs to subsidize car ownership frequently improve people's ability to find and retain work. In short, even though owning and operating a car is onerous for poor families, there are so few alternatives that car ownership is close to a necessity in most of the country. So why do we keep overbuilding, despite poor traffic safety records, evidence of failure, and stated policies that seem to be so far out of alignment with outcomes? I'm going to focus on two main reasons that I mentioned earlier in the talk: finance and evaluation. Despite stated changes in priorities, ICE-T changed neither how we decide where we spend our transportation dollars, nor how we raise them. To help show how and where highways get built, I want to go back to where I started this talk. These maps show the originally planned interstate highway investments approved for Dallas and Fort Worth, Texas, as part of the 1956 Act. And the red star shows the approximate location on the map where President Bush signed ICE-T into law 35 years later. And this map shows the quantity of state, federal, and county highways that now shape and dominate the Dallas region's urban form. Nearly all of them have been paid for by dedicated state and federal gas tax revenues. Nearly all of them have been justified by a planning and evaluation system developed around 100 years ago to justify early highway investments. The Dallas region's transportation plans also paint a clear picture of how little ICE-T did to change regional highway planning. In April of 1991, the North Central Texas Council of Governments, Dallas's metropolitan planning organization, published its proposed $15.8 billion long-range transportation plan for Dallas. Just 8 months later, President Bush signed ICE-T, and the Regional Council set about updating its plans to conform with the new law's requirements. The updated plans put substantial discussion into how it responds to a new fiscally constrained environment, prioritizes congestion mitigation, and conforms to new air quality regulations. But at the end of the day, not very much changed. The updated plan allocated $15.2 instead of $15.8 billion and made near identical recommendations for new highways and highway widenings. The dollars continue to be raised from gas taxes and other transportation sources that were set aside for transportation, and most of the congestion management investments were effectively capacity increases, such as new toll lanes and reconstructed arterials and intersections. The plan claims to reduce pollution by allowing people to drive faster and therefore spend less time in traffic. And despite substantially increasing roadway capacity, regional planners predicted that this plan would result in decreased vehicle travel and a 6.1% reduction in volatile organic compounds relative to doing nothing. So how do transportation planners decide which highways to build and widen? The process is relatively straightforward. Traffic engineers and planners examine origin and destination patterns, predict how traffic will grow, and for the most part recommend building roadways that are large enough and wide enough to accommodate that predicted growth. As a shortcut, they frequently simply assume that traffic will increase by 3% every year, thereby doubling every 20 years. Their plans then make claims about how much congestion investing in highways will prevent. In the case of the Dallas plan, the addition of 1,700 lane miles of freeway were estimated to save $3 billion per year in congestion costs, resulting in estimated benefits that exceeded costs by a factor of 4.6. So essentially, here's the estimated congestion if no highways are built. Here's, if we did the plan we really wanted to do, here's the plan that we could afford, and this difference is the value of the plan. The general approach is over a century old. This figure on the left shows Boston's traffic in 1927, and the image on the right shows the increased traffic in 1965 with predictions of chaos without massive investments in highways. And to be honest, the biggest difference in the methodology is the maps were substantially more beautiful than the clunky maps of 1991 and 3. As in the rest of the country, the results of Dallas's plans were less than spectacular. Congestion remains endemic. Between 1990 and 2010, roughly the time period of the plan, the number of hours that drivers lost in traffic increased from 78,000 to 175,000 per year, according to one popular source. Thus far, I've focused this talk on the consequences and practices of overbuilding. I've also briefly discussed the role that finance and project evaluation play in encouraging overbuilding despite stated public policies at odds. I'd now like to briefly touch on 3 recommended ways to try to stop overbuilding and reverse course. From there, I'll move on to discuss what I think some of the implications of the findings are for urban Mexico. The first law of holes, if anyone knows it, offers an important first step in addressing an overbuilt highway system. When you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. The first step to correcting an overbuilt roadway system is to acknowledge that it is overbuilt and to stop widening, stop expanding the network. New road investments do not solve congestion or spur substantial economic growth. They are not a wholesale investment in America's future, at least not one that creates more wealth than they cost. And more and wider roads encourage more driving, which generates more pollution, more traffic fatalities, more sprawling settlement patterns, and more maintenance and reconstruction costs in the future. As Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said of U.S. transportation policy in 1991, "We have poured enough concrete." Expanding roadway infrastructure should be a policy of last resort rather than a default public policy, but that's much easier said than done. Once we stop building more highways, we need to change how we finance roads. Specifically, we need to decouple how much we pay for highways from how much people drive. There are a number of ways to do this. I'm going to focus on one. At present, we collect transportation dollars about evenly from all car trips based on the gasoline tax, regardless of how expensive that trip is. That is, you pay about the same amount into the transportation system, whether you're driving on a busy urban highway during the peak hours, an empty highway, or even a quiet residential street at night. We then use the money We then use the money collected by everyone to support the most expensive trips by widening the congested urban freeway. This lowers the costs and diverts more drivers to the most congested hours of the most congested highways. And this is the finance system that William Vickery was referring to in 1963 when he claimed that in no other major area of pricing are practices so irrational, so out of date, and so conducive to waste as in urban transportation. It would be much cheaper, healthier, economically efficient, and environmentally beneficial simply to pay for the transportation system using tolls charged during the most congested hours. This would help break the cycle that perpetuates overbuilding and provide a steady stream of revenue that can be tied to the cost of the transportation system as well as potential benefits. We should be charging for the most economically, environmentally, and socially costly trips, not going out of our way to subsidize them. The last policy shift I want to address is how the transportation system gets measured and evaluated. I touched on this briefly when discussing Dallas's regional transportation plan. We essentially project traffic growth onto city streets, measure expected congestion, and recommend highway and other road investments to mitigate that congestion. We really only focus on vehicle speeds and congestion, and we multiply the value of time by speed increases and call it a day. Instead, we should focus on how transportation investments influence people's ability to get to jobs, shops, hospitals, places of worship, and other activities. Access to jobs is particularly important and likely correlated with other measures of accessibility. Let me use the estimated effects of the proposed $2.1 billion in highway investments that were part of Greater San Antonio's 2040 mobility plan. San Antonio's highway planners predicted that the investment would save drivers time and result in a total reduction in average travel time of 5.5%. When estimating the effects on accessibility, however, planning scholars Louis Merlin, Joe Grangs, and Jonathan Levine found that the highway investments mostly just shuffled households and economic activities. There was even a small loss in net overall accessibility as people move to a new highway, areas around a new highway investment. We should not be spending hundreds of billions of dollars to shuffle households and businesses across the region. Accessibility evaluation offers one potential path for moving away from the current evaluation system that tends to encourage overbuilding. I'd now like to shift gears and talk about what I think some of the general takeaways are for my book for urban Mexico and other parts of the world more generally. My colleagues and I did several studies comparing urban form and travel behavior in the largest 100 metropolitan areas in the US and Mexico. And one of the largest differences between the two contexts is the amount of roadway per capita. US cities have 6 times more roadway lane miles, and since roads tend to be wider and have more lanes in the US, the difference is even more substantial. From this perspective, it is less clear whether Mexican cities are similarly overbuilt. However, there are other substantial differences suggesting that there's probably quite a different optimal mix of roadway in the US and Mexico. For example, Mexican cities are substantially denser and more reliant on walking and public transportation, and households also tend to have lower incomes and lower access to private cars. There are also substantial differences in how the cities are structured and organized. The image on the left shows Baltimore, Maryland, a metropolitan area that was about average in our data set in terms of density, income, and the other measures of urban form. The city's downtown holds a high share of the jobs, population, and transit use, with rapidly declining densities and transit use in the surrounding suburbs. In Querétaro, an approximately average city by our measures in Mexico, the historic center dominates downtown, and the suburban fringe is relatively dense and highly reliant on transit. Querétaro has also grown substantially differently. In 1990, the map on the left, most of the most densely populated neighborhoods in red and orange were centrally located. The lower density blue and gray neighborhoods were generally on the periphery. By 2010, the city expanded and nearly doubled in population, but also saw substantial growth in suburban population density. This growth tends to be a mix of social housing, like the image on the top, or popular auto-constructed neighborhoods, like the image on the bottom. How people travel in these parts of the city has important implications for public health, environmental degradation, and people's ability to access jobs, schools, and other activities. In this context, the primary challenge is likely not overbuilding, but improving transit access to the suburban periphery. Otherwise, as household income increases and the government continues investing in roadway, people will switch to cars. There are also substantial differences in urban travel behavior that suggest the importance of the role of building more highways and arterials. The box plot on the right shows that outside of a handful of US urban areas, nearly everyone drives. And just looking at the box plot, I bet nearly everyone in the room can guess what these cities are. What city is that? New York, one up, Chicago, San Francisco, Boston. In Mexican cities, by contrast, there is much more of a mix. This suggests that shifts in urban form and the mix of roadway investments can play a substantially more important role in mode choice in a Mexican than a US context. For example, my co-author Mei-Ching Li and I found that increasing the amount of roadway in Mexican cities by 10% would likely increase car commuting by around 4%. In the US, by contrast, that same increase only shifted car commuting by about 0.5%. And that's because outside of a few cities, there's so much roadway and such low density that everyone drives. As I said earlier, it's essentially a prerequisite to participating in the economy and social activities. As with my takeaways for the US, I want to briefly state just 3 takeaways in a Mexican context. My first recommendation is that the Mexican state and federal governments focus on transit investments instead of road investments. The plurality of residents rely on transit, but residents are also quite sensitive to shifting modes in response to worsening transit or improving automobile conditions. In this context, it's particularly worrisome that a Mexican NGO reported that 80 to 90% of federal and state transportation spending go to road investments, and just 7 to 11% go to transit, pedestrian, or cycling investments. The next 2 recommendations are nearly identical, though there are some contextual differences that we don't have time to discuss. I recommend policies that decouple how much people drive from how much and where we invest. Mexico has a substantially higher share of tolled roads, but these would function a lot better if they charge more for the most expensive trips instead of a flat rate throughout the day. And the last recommendation is to evaluate transportation investments based on how they affect accessibility rather than how they affect travel times or congestion. And while my book largely focuses on a US policy context, I hope that it can also provide some lessons on what not to do in terms of national surface transportation policies. So how do the findings from Overbuilt relate to global transportation policy? First, I think it's important to acknowledge that most people live in settlements that look and feel a lot more like Mexican cities than US ones. These cities are substantially denser and have far fewer highways. People are also a lot more likely to get around by public transportation, motorcycle, or foot. And in these contexts, despite having substantially fewer highways, there are also substantially more opportunities to influence form and travel behavior through investments in public transportation. There are also opportunities to shape development by raising transportation revenues from the most expensive peak hour trips in the most congested parts of cities. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your comments and questions. Yeah, Jeannie.
So wonderful presentation and beautifully written in the book. Congratulations. I'm wondering if you were going to add anything on climate change and emissions in your future research.
I do not add that much. Don't talk that much about green. Oh, sure. The question was about discussing greenhouse gas emissions as relates to the book.
Future research.
Maybe future research. I think in many ways, one of the important estimated external costs of driving is greenhouse gas emissions. The conservative estimates that I kind of used have a much lower cost of carbon than kind of what's been more recently estimated. And I guess part of the reason is there is so much work that relates transportation to greenhouse gas emissions that I kind of intentionally did not want to focus on it too much. But there are clear relationships. And I think we have a lot of really low-hanging fruit when it comes to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And to talk about those, I would invite Megan to come up and speak, because our global air transportation system is responsible for so many greenhouse gas emissions, and there are so many easy opportunities to reduce it. So if kind of my default was to use transportation to influence kind of greenhouse gas emissions outcomes, I probably wouldn't go straight to overbuilt, even though there is a clear relationship. Jay.
My question is just related to highway widening. So I've had the opportunity to work with freeway buyers across the United States, Houston, different cities who are trying to stop a highway from being widened. And their main play is to say that this is going to cause induced demand. But what we've been seeing, at least in that movement, is that doesn't necessarily stop state DOTs from widening roads. So what would your approach take, rather than just saying reduce demand? How can we convince them to rethink this?
I mean, I think kind of similar to what I stated earlier, I think the first most important thing is to acknowledge that there is overbuilding, and it's really hard to go anywhere if state departments of transportation aren't acknowledging that. So I think that's kind of a first step. And a second step is, I think we need to change finance. We have natural incentives to enjoy the system that we have. You add more roadway, you get more driving, you get more gas tax revenue, you invest in more roadway. We have this cycle that really perpetuates this ever-expanding roadway system that we then continue to rebuild and maintain. So I think it's challenging. Another thing that I would I think maybe advocate for is reusing more of the land for things that are kind of giving back some of that land to the private sector. I think so often when we see these freeway removals, there's no revenue generation at all. It becomes a public park, and public parks are lovely. But tearing down a highway, rebuilding a highway, they're extremely expensive. And when they were first built, they tore down, massive, swaths of cities and, apartment complexes, houses, commercial centers. And I think it would be nice to replace much of that space with those types of activities. And that could also provide some of the money to pay for it. Because right now there's very little money that's available to unbuild. John?
Yeah, that's a great presentation, incredibly clear. I think I agree with all of your conclusions and diagnostics. But two observations. I've traveled a lot around the world and seen different settlement forms, different transportation systems. It seems to me Americans are uniquely different in two ways. We equate home ownership with suburban single-family housing in ways that very few other cultures do. For example, China has equivalent home ownership rates, but they don't have equivalent suburbs. And we don't like to pay the social costs of our consumption decisions. Given the choice politically when both to pay the externality costs, we constantly refuse to in ways that other countries don't. Given those, I would say those are sort of cultural underlying preferences, and they sort of shape continued advance of suburbia in America. I wonder if your prescriptions are strong enough to undo that, or how might they change that? And lastly, a similar note, you didn't mention parking charges. We both know Don Shoup very well, or did know him. Would they help higher parking charges?
I guess let me respond to the first comment. I mean, this is just more of I've lived in many different places. I don't fundamentally believe that there are really that great differences. Like, there's more difference within groups than across groups. And I think that at the end of the day, a lot of kind of that, whether you term it American exceptionalism or differences, and a lot of it is responses to public policy. A lot of it's responses to a lot of land. But people respond to kind of their, maybe to say it in an overly nerdy way, they're available choice sets, and we affect those choice sets through public policy. And I think we would have a very different set of outcomes if, the predecessor to the Federal Highway Administration had done what President FDR asked them to do, which was to look at financing the system by tolls, which they kind of said, oh, nope, we're actually, that's not possible. So let's do this other system instead. Or two, he also asked them to look into building the highway system using land value capture. Basically said, well, if these are going to generate a lot of value, like you say, let's buy up twice the amount of land, and we'll use the land kind of around the highways, and there will be increased value, and we'll recoup the costs, and that's how we'll fund the highway system. And the Federal Highway Administrator basically responded, that's a great idea. Let's take the extra land and we will save it for widening the highway later. So we do have, this path dependency that's based on decisions that were made. I don't think if we followed the recommendations in my book, suddenly people are not driving. I think kind of the ideal is that in many places, people are driving shorter distances, probably spending similar amounts of time driving, but consuming kind of a lot less resources at the same time. And then parking, there's so much written on parking, and part of the reason that I avoided talking too much about parking is the focus of this book is really on federal policy and how that translates to states. And the federal government doesn't have that much control over parking policy, with the exception of tax preferences for providing parking for employers. So that's the main reason it doesn't feature heavily. Yeah, Miles.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I wonder your thoughts on how your book will contribute to the political conversation these days. And case in point, our current governor, who's widely assumed to be exploring the presidential run, he's celebrated for rebuilding interstate 12 days that he's been unable to fund conception for several years. And that's considered a key part of his campaign to be a national level politician that says to be rebuilding interstate. So I was just interested to see how your book, how you think it'll be a part of that conversation and potentially influence a future kind of presidential consideration.
I'm honestly not sure. I think in many ways that question is kind of above my pay grade, and I can have some. To be honest, I kind of wanted to stop this book on the first law of holes. And as an academic, a lot of what I like to do is observe problems, and that is I think if you have a lot of evidence of being overbuilt, just stopping and getting people to acknowledge that and then come up with ways to address it, I think is the ideal next step. So if I were to be able to influence public policy, the way that I would be most interested in influencing it is for people to acknowledge that this is a problem, that there is more to the problem than simply we don't have enough money. I think if you go to the federal level, most of the conversations are about we don't have enough transportation money, how do we get more? And I don't think that's the fundamental problem. And I would love to be able to shift the narrative a little bit away from that. In terms of rebuilding highways, of course, we need to rebuild and maintain lots and lots of highways. I think just not quite as many as we have. And I think that the process of unbuilding is also going to be very slow. It took us at least 70 years to get where we are today. The idea that you could change that within a single election cycle, I think, is problematic, and you could create a lot of harm by, if we just said, let's not rebuild any highways and just wait for them to deteriorate. So I think we need some policies in place to help make the transition, but it's going to be slow. To your other point, I guess I've gotten some pushback on this book, particularly in regards to my thoughts on transit. I do not think you can solve our national transportation problems through investments in transit. There just simply does not function in too many parts of the country. And to your point about being a kind of national politician, a national level politician talking about transit in a context where for 90% of the country, transit is not a realistic option. I don't know how you kind of have that conversation in a way that's productive. And that's not to say that there isn't a need for better funding for SEPTA. There's not a need for better funding in DC and Boston and New York. But I think in many ways that it would be better if that were less a part of the national conversation and more a part of state and metropolitan conversations. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting to hear about the level of car buildings and suburban American households, and I can think about how younger people are similarly they're not really buying houses at the greater rate, and also I think I've also read that younger people are less likely to get their driver's license and moving to nicer cities. So I do think it's a possible solution, instead of car ownership, places that don't have transit systems, something more like car share, or I don't know, I guess both the solution for people who don't really go to New York or Boston, and really want their driver's license, but they can't afford a car. I guess it will be something in the middle.
Well, unfortunately, a big part of that middle right now is people driving poorly maintained cars without proper licensing and insurance, which I view as a kind of a symptom of an over-reliance on cars and highways. I think that there are probably lots of small policies that are helpful at the margin, but kind of maybe automated vehicles offer some sort of opportunity where you can provide better levels of transit service in areas that have kind of lower concentrations of origins and destinations. I think that's something you kind of hope for, but fundamentally, I think if you are living in an environment that's built around cars and you cannot afford a car, it's a challenge. It's a big challenge. And part of resolving that challenge may be providing access to cars, particularly for low-income households. Yeah, sure.
You tend to put a lot of the blame on bureaucrats. I mean, you look at in our conversations. But to me, part of the dysfunction in this country is the unique role played by Congress, unlike other countries, on transportation decisions, essentially one by one. That goes back to the deal made by Eisenhower back in the day to get the system built. You shift a lot of the power over to the politicians, who are, of course, going to use that as temporal politics and so on and so forth. In most other countries, you have a transportation. It's never perfect, but you have a budget, and the Ministry of Transportation, Department of Transportation, whatever it's called, does its job. Yes, there are some projects that are important, where there could be political decisions, political interference, but also political decisions, and at some level this is right, but there's far less here. It's really down to every large project I want my gas tax back from my state, so I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and so on and so forth. And I don't see an obvious way out of that system, except for centralization with the White House, which.
I mean, there was a lot of discussion leading up to Ice-T of ending federal involvement in the transportation system. The original 1956 Act, it was supposed to end, I think, in 1975 or something like that, and the federal government was supposed to get out of the business. I think in many ways, there are advantages to kind of reducing the role of the federal government in surface transportation policy. So I think that's potentially an option. We're, I think, the only OECD country that has kind of dedicated transportation revenues in the way that we do. And, you know, probably better just to put that in the general fund and have people negotiate over transportation in the same conversation as housing and healthcare. I think things like that are maybe possible. I also think that there was quite a bit of subversion of what policymakers actually wanted by the highway builders. And I think there's some evidence of that, you know, historically over time. And there's some evidence that a lot of people didn't really know what was in the 1944 maps that essentially mapped out the highway system when they voted on it. And so yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of dysfunction to resolve in a lot of different areas. I wish I had a better answer. Yeah.
Thank you. Just want to thank you very much, Eric, for this. I want to make a small correction to the climate change issue.
Oh, of course.
Aggregate vehicular transportation is the highest emitter of greenhouse gases, but per passenger airline is.
Of course.
So
but there's also
we've all got work to do.
There's the what can you reduce? Not work to do. We'll talk.
We'll talk outside. But at any rate, this has been a spectacular presentation. And everyone should know that if you'd like a copy of that book, it's right back there. And Eric will sign them, I think, won't you?
Sure. Yeah,
exactly. The Penn Bookstore is offering them for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, and thank you everyone for joining us.